I hope you will forgive me for sitting down while I preach, but some of the side effects from my surgery make it so that this is better for me. So I appreciate your grace and understanding. I'm thankful to be together this morning on this first glorious Lord's Day of a new year. We are a privileged people in a privileged environment, and it's always good to be together with this family of God's people. I am so thankful to be a part of this group, such a wonderful group, and so glad that you are my family. I want to think this morning about the question Jesus asked of the blind Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10. Bartimaeus hears that Jesus is close by and starts crying out to him, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And they try to silence him, and he's not to be silenced. He wants to get Jesus' attention, and he finally does. And Jesus calls and has him come to him. And when he comes to Jesus' question to him is, "What would you have me do for you?" I want you to think about that for a moment, not from the standpoint of blind Bartimaeus. Kind of seems almost to us, at least to me, I'll just put myself in this camp so that I'm not throwing anybody else under the bus. Seems an odd question to ask a blind man. What would you have me do for you? I mean, considering Jesus is the miracle worker and has healed many blind people before, it seems odd that he would ask a blind man, "What would you want me to do for you?" And I'm not so sure it's for blind Bartimaeus' benefit that he asks that question. In fact, I'd like to think it's for me that he asks the question, "What would you have me do for you?" And I want you to think about your answer to that question this morning. And I want you to think about it seriously. I want you to reflect on it realistically, because I know we sometimes know the right answer for questions like this. Well, I just want you to save me. But I want you to think about what your question really is. What do you really want Jesus to do for you? Not eternally, but today. If Jesus were here and were willing to cure whatever it is that ails you, whatever it is that you're struggling with, what would you ask Jesus to do for you today? And I suspect that if you're like me, that far too often the answer to that question will be far more shallow than I would like to admit. I would just like for the pain to go away. I would just like for the struggle that I'm facing right now to be over. And we forget how many times before in our lives, I've only been alive for 51 years. To some of you, that seems like a very short period of time. To others, that seems like I'm ancient. But I know that there have been other times in my life where I would have asked for the same thing. And I can look back on my life now and see that things worked out just fine from the thing that I struggled with before, and yet I still find myself struggling, even 51 years later and having been a Christian for 28 years. I go through things and I think, if God would just take this away, it would be enough. Forgetting all the things that he's done before, and forgetting the real point of this lesson, which is God always gives more. And I want you to think about that point this morning as we look at some examples from Scripture. Jesus asks Bartimaeus, "What would you have me do for you?" And of course we know his answer, and we can think about our own to that particular question. But I want to turn to 1 Samuel for our first example. And I'm going to answer this question, "What would you have me do for you?" for these three people that we're going to look at this morning, or in one case, a group of people. But in 1 Samuel chapter 1, Many of us will remember that this is the beginning of the story of Samuel, who becomes a prophet and a judge in Israel. But Samuel's beginning wasn't like a lot of prophets and judges, in that his mother was married to a man who had a couple of wives, and her name was Hannah. The rival's name was Peninnah. And the struggle that Hannah had was that Peninnah had a lot of sons and daughters, and she had none. And all she wanted was a child. And that's understandable for some of you as women. You understand that point, what it is to want a child. Some of you understand it perhaps in ways that others simply cannot. But in this day and age, and with the situation that she was in, she was, if you look at her petition, desperate to have a child. So her answer to Jesus' question, what would you have me do for you? Her answer would simply be, I want a child. Give me a child. Specifically, she says a son in 1 Samuel chapter 1. We look in verse 10, and she prays out her heart to God, very distressed, and she prays to the Lord and was in fact weeping. And she made a vow saying, O Lord of heaven's armies, if you would truly look on the suffering of your servant and would keep me in mind and not neglect your servant and give your servant a male child, then I will dedicate him to the Lord all the days of his life. His hair will never be cut. Please, God, just give me a son. If you will give me a son, I will dedicate him to you for his entire life. He will be yours. I will give him back to you in thanksgiving and appreciation for the gift that you have given to me. We go on over in the same chapter to verse 20, and it tells us that Hannah became pregnant, and in the course of time she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, thinking, I asked the Lord for him. And so we see that she had an answer to her prayer, and the answer was that God gave her a son. We go on to read the account, and she did exactly what she said. After she had weaned the child, she took him up to the tabernacle at this point, dedicated him to the Lord, and he remained there in the tabernacle where he learned from Eli, the high priest, became a priest himself, later became a judge and a prophet in all of the ways that God wanted to use this man. She got what she asked for. She wanted a son, and she got one. That would have been, I think, would have been the answer to the question, what would you have me do for you? I just want a son. And God gave her that. But it wasn't just any son. This son was special in all of the ways that we've already described and looked at. But that's not where Hannah's story ends. She didn't just get a son who became a priest and a prophet and a judge. We go on and read that in chapter 2, beginning in verse 18, that Samuel was ministering with the favor of the Lord. The boy was dressed in a linen ephod, and his mother used to make him a small robe and brought it to him from time to time when she would go up with her husband to make the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, May the Lord establish descendants for you from this woman in place of the one that she dedicated to the Lord. And then they would go to their home. And indeed, the Lord attended to Hannah. She got pregnant and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew up before the Lord. Her question, or her answer to the question would be, oh, that you would just give me a son, that I might just have a child that came from me, that was my own. I would dedicate him to you. And God said, okay, here's your son. And Hannah did all that she vowed. And God said, okay, here's 3 more sons and 2 daughters to take the place of the one that you dedicated to me. Here's the one you asked for, and here are 5 more to go on top of that. God always gives more. We go over to the New Testament for our second example. We're going to look in John's account. This is, interestingly enough, one of the few accounts in the life of Jesus that is found in all 4 of the Gospels. In a lot of these instances, we find the account in one Gospel, or maybe a couple of them, or maybe in 3. But this particular one's found in all 4 Gospels. We're going to look at John's account, because there's a point that's made here, a point that's revealed to us in this particular text that's different from the other 4, and that sheds a little more light on the situation. Jesus went away, verse 1 of chapter 6, to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they were observing the miraculous signs he was performing on the sick. So Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down there with his disciples. And we're told the Jewish feast of the Passover was near. That point's also unique to John, but that's not the point we're looking at. Verse 5 says, Then Jesus, when he looked up and saw a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, Where can we buy bread so that these people may eat? Now Jesus said to this to test him, for he knew what he was going to do. And Philip replied, 200 silver coins, or maybe your translation says 200 denarii, worth of bread would not be enough for them to each have a little. We'll stop there for just a minute. 200 denarii, or 200 silver coins, was about 9 months' wages in this time period. And what Philip says to Jesus is, 9 months' wages worth of bread wouldn't be enough for all of the people who are gathered here to have just a little bit, to have a snack. And yet Jesus knew what he was going to do. And what we find as we go forward is the only one who seems to be prepared, and maybe he only because his mother cared enough to send him away with something in his hand, is a little boy who has 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's his lunch. And that would barely be a snack for a handful of them. And Philip says that 9 months' wages worth of bread would not even be enough for all of them to have a snack. Now, I want you to think about it. If you're one of these people, and we find out later it's 5,000 men along with the women and children. If you're one of these people who's been following Jesus and you've been out here with him all day long and you're out in a desolate place and there's nowhere to get food and you weren't smart enough to bring it along with you, and Jesus asked the question, what would you have me do for you? The answer might be, just a snack would be enough. I just need something to tide me over to carry me until I can get back home and eat. A snack, just a snack. And we find out that there wouldn't be enough of a snack for all of them if 9 months' wages were spent on bread. And we find that the only one that has anything is a little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But Jesus tells his apostles, have them all sit down. And we're told there in verse 10 that the men, when they sat down, about 5,000 in number, and Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed the bread to those who were seated, and then he did the same with the fish. And look at the next phrase. As much as they wanted. 9 months' wages of bread wouldn't have been enough for them to have a snack, all of them. And yet Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish and provides enough for all of them to be satisfied. But wait, that's not the end of the story. Because they all have enough, it says, to be satisfied. They have as much as they want. And when, verse 12, they were all satisfied, Jesus said to his disciples, gather up the broken pieces that are left over so that nothing is wasted. And they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces from the 5 barley loaves left over by the people who had eaten. God always gives more. These people would have been happy with a snack. I'm reading into that, but I think that's true. I've been hungry before. It's been a while since my last meal, and my belly begins to gnaw on my backbone. And I think if I just had a snack to tide me over until I could get a full meal, I would be happy with a snack. These people would have been happy with a snack. But not only did Jesus not give them a snack, he gave them enough that they were all satisfied. And then, out of 5 loaves and 2 fish, I want to think about that for a minute. 5 loaves and 2 fish wouldn't have filled 12 baskets in the first place. And yet Jesus takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, has it divided among 5,000 men, not including the women and children, so that all of them are satisfied. And then when they go around and gather up the scraps that are left over, and I don't know about you, but I just can't imagine leaving scraps behind when you're that hungry. I was always taught to clean my plate. But they go and gather up the scraps that are left over, and of the bread scraps that are left over, they fill up 12 baskets. This is not the only time Jesus does this. There's another occasion in the Gospels that he feeds 4,000 people. And interestingly enough, his disciples have seen all manner of miraculous signs that Jesus has done, including taking 5 loaves and 2 fish and feeding 5,000 people and having 12 baskets left over. And when he asks at the 4,000 about where they're going to get food, they don't seem to have a clue. And it's easy for us to look at that and think, well, that's just foolish. And yet, as I said before, I do the same thing. I can look at all the examples in Scripture. I can look at the Hannahs who had not only Samuel in answer to her prayer, but the 3 sons and the 2 daughters on top of that. I can look at the example here of Jesus feeding 5,000 men, not including the women and children, with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and having 12 baskets full of leftovers. I can look at my own life and see all the times when God has answered my prayers above and beyond what I could have ever imagined. And yet still when I struggle, I think, God, where are you? And when are you going to take care of this? So it's not that odd that the disciples, when they come to the 4,000 and Jesus says where we're going to get food for them, are a little confused and struggle with the answer. Because we do the same thing. But God always gives more. Last example I want to look at is found in the book of Deuteronomy, in the last chapter of that book. Deuteronomy 34. And I don't know about you, but maybe you're like me. This is the account of the death of Samuel, another prophet of God. Some of the Jews would say he's the greatest prophet of God. Some of us might say he's the greatest prophet of God before Jesus. But Moses, this is the end of the life of Moses. And we remember the story of Moses, how Moses was born into a Jewish household when the Egyptians were killing off Jewish boys. And Moses' mother hid him and put him in a basket and hid him in the bulrushes of the river. And the daughter of Pharaoh found him and took him into her own house and raised him up as her own child. And so he was raised in the household of Pharaoh, essentially. And then when he got older, he saw the people of God struggling and suffering. And he went to them and cared about them and tried to demonstrate his love for them. And they didn't understand yet what God had in store for them. And so Moses ended up having to flee to Midian for 40 years, where he lived, where he ended up being married and having children. And then he goes back to the land when God finally convinces him that he will be with him and help him, and leads the children of Israel out of Egypt on the way to the promised land. And we remember poor Moses, how as obedient as he was to God, as humble a man as he was, as great a servant, not only to God, but to the people of Israel as he was, all of the complaining they did against him and against God and against his brother Aaron during this time they were going. And when they finally got to the land God was going to give them, they decided they weren't strong enough to take it. And so God makes them wander for 40 years. And Moses has to wander with them, all the while listening to all these complaints. And Moses, at one point, when in a fit of anger, when the people are thirsty, disobeys the commandment that God gives. He speaks rashly with his lips. And because he doesn't glorify and honor God on that occasion the way he should have, God says, you're going to lead them to the land, but you won't take them in. You're not going to see the land. And I don't know if you're like me, but I felt sorry for Moses for a long time. I mean, how awful. Here he had to live in Midian for 40 years because the people of Israel were too stupid to see that God was trying to deliver them from Egyptian bondage through him. He goes back and finally they see it. And God shows them all these great signs, leads them out, carries them through the Red Sea, kills all the Egyptian army that's chasing them, leads them through the wilderness, feeding them manna and giving them water from rocks and other places and giving them quail. Moses is there and sees all of those things and goes through all of that with the people of Israel. And then he gets to lead them all the way to the threshold of the land, only to be told, yep, you remember that promise I made you that you wouldn't lead them in? You're not going to. This is where you stop. This is where your journey ends. And I felt sorry for him. That seems awful, that Moses would have to go through so much only to, it gets worse. It gets worse. Not only does he not get to lead them in, but we're told in Deuteronomy 34, beginning in verse 1, that Moses ascended from the Rift Valley plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the summit of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord, get this, showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan and all of Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh and all the land of Judah as far as the distant sea, the Negev and the plains of the valley of Jericho, the city of date palms as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it, but you will not cross over there. So not only is it not bad enough that he's had to go through all of this with the children of Israel, only to lead them to the threshold, but then, as if God is rubbing the wound that's festering, he says, go up on this mountain, I'm going to show you the whole land and how great it is, and you'll get to look at it, but you're not going in. And I felt sorry for Moses. Maybe you did too. Because I think if Moses had been asked the question, what would you have me do for you? His answer would have been, oh, that I could just step into the land. Oh, that I could just cross the Jordan and put my foot in the land, and then I'll be ready to go home. I think that might have been Moses' answer to the question. And God says, no, you're not going to go in, but you can look at it. Maddie's got a big smile on her face. I can imagine what she would think if I said, you know that thing that you've wanted so badly? I bought it, and you can look at it, but you can't have it. She knows at 14 years old what that would feel like. And we all know what that feels like too. Maybe we've had the experience. I don't know that we can ever really understand how much greater must have been Moses' thought when he, after all this work and all of this suffering, finally gets to the threshold and sees how great the land is that God's giving him, only to not get to go into it. I don't know that we can really fully grasp how great the disappointment must have been. And yet here he is. And then you know what God does? God takes Moses into the valley of Moab, and he takes Moses' spirit from his body. And we're told, interestingly enough, that Moses, at this point in his life, which would be about 120 years old, was that his eye was still bright. The idea is that Moses still had a lot of energy left. He still had a lot of go power. So he wasn't not going into the land that he had just gotten to look at because he was on his last leg and worn out and ready to die. He wasn't going into the land because that's what God told him. And so God takes him down into the valley of Moab, and he takes his life, takes his spirit from his body, and then God buries Moses there in the valley where nobody knows. I don't know about you, but that's kind of a beautiful picture. Not the picture of Moses seeing the land and then having to die. We don't think that's so beautiful. But the idea of God burying you, that's a pretty special treatment for a pretty special guy. And yet he didn't get to go into the land. But I tell you what he did. And it's more evidence of the fact that God always gives more. Moses wanted to go into the promised land. You know, the land that God had promised to the children of Israel and that he had promised that Moses would lead them into. And the one that God had just shown to him from the top of Mount Nebo. And God said no. But then when he took his spirit, he took him to the true promised land. And I'll tell you what, for a long time I felt sorry for Moses, only to later realize, you know, in one breath Moses was probably horribly disappointed, only to wake up in the next breath with the greatest sense of awe and wonder and appreciation that he had ever had. God always gives more. Yeah, he would have loved to have gone in the promised land, and I think he probably would have answered the question, what would you have me do for you? With, I just want to go in and step foot into the land, and then you can take me. And he didn't get that. But he got so much more than what he could have asked for, and than what he could have anticipated. Because God gave him the real promised land when he took him away from the first one. And that's how God works. God always gives more. In the new covenant, we have, according to the Hebrew writer, better promises enacted through a better high priest and better sacrifices and all these better things that the Hebrew writer talks about. It is a better covenant that we are a part of. And in the old covenant, God's presence dwelt in the midst of the people. And they, through their priests and high priests, could go to God through this mediator. And we have a mediator, Jesus, who calls us not to come groveling and begging at the throne of God for our petition needs, but in Hebrews 4 verse 16 tells us to come boldly to the throne of grace that we may find grace and mercy to help in time of need. We can come boldly before the throne. I mean, it would be something that we could even hope that God might possibly hear and care about our prayers. But that's not what we get in the new covenant. We get to come boldly before the throne of grace knowing God wants to hear from us and that God longs to help with what it is that we have need of. That's the beauty of what we have through Jesus. And in Revelation 22, we get a glimpse of that true promised land in the imagery of this particular text. And I want you to think about how glorious it would be if heaven is really a location, like a specific locale somewhere in the universe. I want you to think about how great it would be to just go and be on the outskirts of heaven, just inside the wall of the city, and have the chance to look at the glory of how beautiful it is. I think the psalmist says something about that when he says, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the temple of God, in the house of God, than to dwell in whatever earthly palace you can think of. I'd rather just stand at the gate and get a chance to look from the wall at the glorious city where God dwells. That would be enough. If we were to answer the question, what would you have me do for you? That ought to be enough for all of us. And yet what we find in Revelation 22 is that the angel showed John the river of the water of life, water as clear as crystal, pouring out from the throne of God and of the Lamb, flowing down the middle of the city's main street. On each side of the river is the tree of life, producing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month of the year. Its leaves are for the healing of the nations. And there will no longer be any curse. And the throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city. His servants will worship him, and they will see his face. We don't get to just stand on the outskirts. We get to be in the middle of it, because God always gives more. You see, it's amazing that we have forgiveness and that we have the hope of anything other than eternal death. That's a glorious promise. But we get so much more than that, because God always gives us more. The apostles had given up a lot to follow Jesus. At least that's how they felt. And Jesus made clear to them that no one has given up houses and fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and wives and children for my sake or the kingdom of heaven's sake, who shall not receive many more in this life, houses and wives and fathers and mothers and brothers and daughters and children, all those different things. And then, as if that's not enough, eternal life. I think it's easy for us sometimes when we struggle with things to think, well, this is not all there is. This is temporary, and ultimately we've got heaven to look forward to. And that's true. And for some of us, maybe that is all we've got to look forward to at this point. But the reality is that if we're honest with ourselves, even in the midst of struggle, we have so much more to be thankful for. And it's focusing on that can sometimes help us get through the struggle and get over the question of thinking that what we really need is just for God to take away the pain. And I'm talking to me. Because it's easy when you suffer to think, I just want this to go away. And sometimes we're like Job, and we get to the point where it's like, just take my life. I just am done with all this. Let me be done with this. Let me come home. I've been there, done that. And I think about that, and I think about the examples I see in Scripture, and I think the reality is that attitude is not one that's really prepared for heaven. That's just the attitude of somebody who's looking to escape the problem that they're going through right now. And what God wants us to do is to fully trust Him. To trust that He sees us. To trust that He, in whatever way that He does, feels the pain that we're going through. And He doesn't relish in the pain. But He knows that it is through that struggle and suffering that our faith grows stronger. You remember Paul in 2 Corinthians 10, who had the thorn in the flesh, and he begged Christ 3 times, just take this away. And I have to believe Paul had to think, this is a hindrance to my ministry. I can't serve you as well with this thorn that I'm suffering with. Just take it away. And the response of Christ was, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, no. But I'll be with you. And you remember what Paul says in that text? That he had learned that through his weakness, he was made strong. And you know why that was that he says? It's because he learned that strength doesn't come by relying on himself and how smart he is and how much power he's got and how much control he can exercise, but it comes by recognizing that ultimately he was powerless and had very little control over anything, and that he needed to trust in the one who has control over everything and who knows all things. And so he learned to trust more fully in God through the struggles that he faced. I'm not saying all this to say that it's easy. It is so easy to read these examples and to think, okay, stop feeling sorry for yourself and just remember God always gives more. How easy is that for me to say? That's pretty easy. And I can show you all these examples. Is there anything wrong about what I said? But I ask you, did Hannah know God? It's not a rhetorical question, really. I want you to think about it. Did Hannah know God? I mean, she did. She knew God. I don't know how much she knew of God, not as much as we know about God through the New Testament, but she knew God. Did the disciples know Jesus? I mean, they had seen him perform all kinds of miracles. That is a rhetorical question. They knew Jesus. They still didn't know him as fully as they should, but they knew him. And they knew the stuff that he had done. It really shouldn't have surprised them that he was going to feed 5,000 people with nothing. Maybe nothing at all. Maybe just some rocks that he turned to bread. I don't know. Did Moses know God? Yeah. And yet every one of them did exactly what you and I do. And in the midst of their struggle, they thought, where are you and why aren't you doing what I want you to do? So I'm not saying all this because it's easy. I'm saying it because all you and I have to do is to learn to trust God. We have to put one foot in front of the other to the best of our ability in the midst of our struggle and realize that God doesn't look at us and think, well, you fool, you know all this stuff. Why can't you see that I'm going to take care of you? He understands who we are, why we struggle, and He's still there for us. And He still intends to give us way more than we can ever think, imagine, or ask for. Ephesians 3 verse 20 makes that point to us pretty clearly. And you know how many times I've quoted that passage, and you know how many times I've said, I can think a lot of things. I've got a pretty wild, vivid imagination. But one of the things I've learned in my life is you can't outthink or out-ask God. Even when we ask for some of the things that maybe we really, truly need, certainly they're things that we want. Frequently, God not only gives us what it is that we're seeking after, maybe not exactly what we asked for, but it was what we were seeking. It was the sentiment of the prayer that we were offering up before God. But not only does He give us what we were asking for, but He gives us so much more than we could have ever imagined. Because that's who God is. And we just have to keep trying to grow in our willingness to trust that that's who He is, that He's faithful, that He always keeps His promises, and that He always wants to give more. He wants to give more now, and He's certainly going to give more in eternity. I don't know about you, but I've sometimes sat and reflected on passages like Revelation 21 and some passages in the Old Testament, Revelation 22, that seem to indicate to us something about the glory of heaven. And as I think about all that, and I think, well, that just sounds glorious, I think, and this is because I know God. I think, you know what? Anything you can think about, any glorious picture you can imagine or conjure in your little brain, heaven is going to be so much greater than all that. Because that's who God is. He always gives more. You think of your great picture, and then just remember, it'll be so much better. Because God gives exceedingly abundantly above all that you can ask or think, or even that He can describe to our finite minds. We've got great things now. Jesus came that He might give us life and that He might give it to us more abundantly. And then we've got the glory of being with God in heaven. Some of my favorite songs are ones that talk about the fact that the greatest glory of heaven will be that we'll get to be there and to look on the face of Jesus. I want you to think about that. Just to be there and to look on His face will through the ages be glory for me. It's one of my favorite songs. And if you want to enjoy that glory, if you want to have the promise that the God who gives more is on your side and wants to bless you in all the ways that He's promised, and we can help you in some way this morning, we invite you to come and let us know while together we stand and sing.